created to have some fun together, sharing and singing. So, join and enjoy.
Our love for opera brings us together. Thanks for being with us in this trip.
So, welcome to the third and unfortunately last trip into the past. We are time travelers for the third year in a row. We have traveled to the past to Mexico City to the 1950s, the program that was called The Expectation. Then we traveled to 1951 when we saw things were settling down. In a way, a very different year, 1951 compared to 1950 and 1952. And this, our third trip, 1952, is called the farewell. Of course, a word like farewell leaves us with a sort of a sensation of nostalgia, and you will see that's pretty much what happened that year. Besides talking about the operas that Maria Meneghini Callas sang in Mexico, I am going to be making reference to many other topics that I didn't refer to in the 1950 and 1951 because from the beginning the plan was to share all these, I would say, miscellaneous topics until the third and final program of this short sub-series inside the Centennial series, the Centennial season, this mini-series of three programs for Maria Callas in Mexico City. I wanted to save some comments for today. So, uh, again, as it has been the case in the previous programs, please keep in mind that we cannot travel with our telecommunication devices. We have no way to make use of Instagram, Facebook, or hey guys, see I am here at the opening or the 1952 presentation of Maria Callas. Remember that since we are traveling back in time, we have to respect those laws of time traveling. And so in 1952, she is still Maria Meneghini Callas. So Maria Meneghini married to the Italian businessman Giovanni Battista Meneghini. We are going to talk about him today also because he plays a very important role in the reasons for this being the last time Maria came to Mexico. And as I was just saying, several or miscellaneous topics around that for the 1950s, the expectation tenor was the German tenor Mr. Baum, the main or the mezzo-soprano singing with them, the great Giulietta Simeonato, and they sang very different arias. We saw opera, sorry, in the 1950s. We saw a display of why she was called La Assoluta. She sang from bel canto, such as in Norma. She also sang Verdi, as it was the case in Aida. And of course, remember that she also sang Il Trovatore, where there was a change, but in the role of the baritone, and there was Tosca. The 1951 had only two titles, and it was Aida and La Traviata. We mentioned in the previous year in Settling Down, in the previous program, in Settling Down, Maria was 27 years, that she only sang Aida, only this time with the very great tenor Mario del Monaco, and Giulietta Simeonato would not return, and in her place would be Oralia Dominguez, the very great contralto Oralia Dominguez singing Abneris. And we talked about her first Traviata in Latin America, which we also mentioned that at some points she sounded already her voice too heavy. We also mentioned in 1951 that she had her first vocal crisis when traveling to Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro was the first opera house where she had problems. So for the 1952, going back to our trip to the 1952, we are going to say in this farewell that now the main tenor is Pippo Giuseppe Di Stefano. So Giuseppe Di Stefano is now the tenor that comes with Maria Meneghini, and also we need to say that given the repertory of this year, there is no mezzo, no particular mezzo, as it was the case of the 1950 and the 1951s. But it is very interesting as we travel back in time somehow, if you allow me the comparison, the 1952 resembles more to the 1950 in the sense that there are several titles, and those titles, once again, prove us the wide spectrum of ranges or types of style which gave Maria what was called La Soprano Assoluta del Siglo. Remember that that was a huge announcement to receive Maria Meneghini, because we are going to see I Puritani from Bellini, of course, very, very clearly in the bel canto style. We will see Lucia di Lammermoor from Maestro Donizetti. Her first role, her first time as Lucia. Then we will also have Traviata, we will have Rigoletto, which is an exemption. So Lucia and Puritani, the first two I mentioned, those two are the ones that are part of the bel canto. Then we have two Verdian titles, Traviata and Rigoletto, and then we will have Puccini, who is closer to the Verismo in Tosca. That's why I was saying that this year resembles a lot more to the 1950s in the sense that she's singing both bel canto, Verdi, and Verismo. I am going to make another note on the terms of La Soluta and this range of titles, but let's go back to the 1952. And we see for the very first time in Mexico, because Mexico does not know this opera, for the very first time, I Puritani from Bellini is being sung. We see that the Palacio de Bellas Artes is completely full. We know, because we have seen Maria in the 1950 and the 1951s, that the reluctance to her voice has been past. It doesn't mean that everybody likes her voice, but it means that we and the people at the Palacio de Bellas Artes have accepted the particularities of the voice of Maria. We know we are not going to listen to a beautiful voice, such as many other sopranos, either local or from other countries, that have sung in the same Palacio de Bellas Artes, but we understand. We know she has that powerful E flat, and we are looking forward to listen again to that high E flat, because we heard it in the 1951 and in the 1950s, where in Aida, of course, referring again to that anecdote of Aida. So we know she has the note. And since we don't know I Puritani, we also have a high expectation in getting to know this opera, and we know that Maria can do it. So as we watch I Puritani, we notice that this is a very spectacular opera. Now we can understand why we have never seen it on a stage, why this is not often on a stage. And the reason is very simple. Both the tenor and the soprano, the baritone does not have those many high, beautiful, spectacular moments, but the tenor and the soprano are very, very, very high in the tessitura. Both the Puritani for the mezzo and for the tenor, for the soprano and for the tenor are almost impossible to sing. And we know that people already very, very, very much loved by the Mexican public, because the public in Mexico is at the Palacio de Bellas Artes not only because we want to see Maria Meneghini, but because this 1952 is twice as great because we have our very much loved people. People started coming to Mexico even before Maria, which means people already loved people, Giuseppe Di Stefano, prior to even getting to know Maria. So we know that having Giuseppe Di Stefano in the cast is an absolute guarantee that we are going to love it. And Pippo Di Stefano happens to be in excellent vocal conditions. We know that his voice is very beautiful. His voice is very warm. She's a divo in all the senses that you can think of the term divo, in singing, in how capricious he was, in how passionate he was. There were lines of people trying to get an autograph from Giuseppe Di Stefano. We know that Maria, at the end in 1952, people also died to get an autograph from her. But even before that, people were already in love for Di Stefano. And those lines were for Di Stefano. And now that we are talking about the farewell, even though this is the last year we are able to see Maria on a stage, we know that people will continue to come. So the love for Giuseppe Di Stefano, at least in terms of duration, if I can speak of that, if not if intensity, which may be equal to Maria's, at least the duration of the love for people and Mexico could last much longer than for Maria, given that, sorry to insist, that people started coming to Mexico even before Maria and continued to come to Mexico and sing even after Maria. So we know that we are watching this I Puritani, which we listened to for the first time, and we are absolutely impressed. What the soprano is doing, you say, "Oh my God!" And what Pipo is doing, you say, "Oh my God!" You are discovering the opera through two of the main voices of that century. And we see how the temperament of Maria matches Pippo's on stage. We know that with Kurt Baum, of course, Maria really couldn't have a good relationship, at least in terms of professionally. Their professional relationship really didn't work. The next year with Carlo del Monaco, there was this competition because Carlo del Monaco was also a divo himself. So there was professional cooperation on stage, but just that. But this 1952 is different because now we have a tenor that is as passionate as Maria is. So they have this positive competition, but it is not a competition as it was in vocal terms the two previous years. Now we have a competition in terms of emotion and transmitting all that emotion to the public. As a result, I Puritani is a great success. In Mexico, I Puritani with Maria Callas and Giuseppe Di Stefano is a huge success. People really love this opera even if they know that there will be many years after they can watch it again because they know this is not a frequent title. You want a frequent title, there should be Aidas, there will be Traviatas, there will be Rigolettos, there will be Bohemes, but I Puritani certainly not. So we people are very satisfied with what we saw in I Puritani. And then the next title that we watch in this 1952 is Lucia di Lammermoor. And it happens with Lucia di Lammermoor the same thing that happened to us in Traviata the previous year. We can see that she's at some parts too heavy. We can see that Maria hasn't nailed the role yet because same case as Traviata and Tosca, Maria will take years, as any other artist would do, to build the opera, the character, the way she wants. So every time, and we know it from her, every time she works on a given character for a given opera, she discovers and keeps building on the interpretation of what she wants. So this is her first Lucia, which happens to be a very powerful Lucia. Remember also that in the 1952s, Maria still has this very huge voice, very powerful voice. I am pretty sure that in the decades to come, you would not see that a voice as huge as Maria's would also be able to sing Lucia. Again, if you want to ask yourself if what you saw in Lucia di Lammermoor is perfect, the answer is certainly not. There are several moments when you are unable to distinguish if she's singing like a Verdian role because her powerful voice made it seem like that, and there are many nuances that Maria seems not to have understood yet. So the Lucia di Lammermoor that we are watching may not be perfect in terms of music, in terms of technique and the musicality, but it is very interesting as it is the first time that we are able to see how the artist is approaching the role. And there is something that I wanted to mention in particular regarding this Lucia. Not only is the first time she sings this Lucia, but also we notice how she goes about Ardon Vincenzi and the later, incomplete is La Scena di Pazzia, uh, and she's going to sing the calm part, the Ardon Vincenzi, which will later turn into Spardi d'Amaro Pianto, where the first part has an optional high note, which Maria happens to sing. But I would like to invite you because I am not going to be adding to this to today's program. But if you want to listen to that Lucia di Lammermoor from the 1952s in the Ardor Vincenzi, she doesn't keep the high note of the Ardor Vincenzi even. She falls in trouble after the first 2 seconds of having gone for the high note. And the reason why I am mentioning this because we as time travelers, we are at advantage because we know what is going to happen later. And even though it is said that for some people the vocal crisis of Maria started in the late 50s, for others after the 1962 or 1965 or 6, truth is that as I was paying attention to this recording, I noticed that Maria, even in the 1952s, already had some problem in singing some high notes, which would later accentuate in later recordings. That's why it was so interesting for me to notice that in the Ardor Vincenzi, for wrapping up her optional high note in Ardor Vincenzi, her high note falls in trouble very, very quickly. This one also caught my attention because remember that she comes from the 1950 and 1951, where she's able to sing that E flat, whole power, whole orchestra over you, whole other singers over your voice, and the note is very clear and powerful. And now that she's going lighter, much more exposed, of course, because with lighter orchestration, you notice everything. Maria falls in trouble. So I would invite you to pay attention to that carefully because I am going to mention it again. Maria has trouble with the high note at the end of the Arton Vincenzi. So one get a little nervous because right after comes the Spargida Maro Pianto, which will also request a high note from hers. And this time she does it much better than what she did a couple of minutes before with the Ardon Vincenzi. Maybe she knew that if she cracked that note, she would be in trouble. But we also know, time travelers, that years later, that's exactly the same note, that is exactly the same passage where she cracked the note in the presence of the president of Italy. So again, we as time travelers, we are at an advantage because now we can see a timeline happening in the deterioration of her voice. 1951, after leaving Mexico, she has her first vocal crisis when in Rio de Janeiro. When she comes back in the 1952, her Puritani is close to perfect, pretty much no problem, except for some excesses in the singing. She has no trouble with the technique in the voice. But for Lucia di Lammermoor, for the first time, we listen to her having trouble in singing a high note in the Ardon Vincenzi. Much better for the Sparky d'Amaro Pianto, but still not perfect. And this is a hypothesis of mine. Maria started having trouble for singing high notes of roles that were much lighter than her voice required. Remember, well, by the way, it is multifactorial. Losing a voice can be for a number of reasons, and I truly believe that one of the reasons why Maria lost her voice is because she sang many roles that were not suited to her voice. One of them being, of course, I Puritani, the other ones lighter roles that required high notes, such as Puritani and Lucia di Lammermoor. So, but still, we notice something else in her Ardon besides the problem that she has with the high note, that the same cadenzas and the same ornaments she sings in Mexico are pretty much what she's going to keep for the next 8 years when she was still able to sing this role. Even if Maria evolved in her Lucia, giving more of an accent here, keeping a note there, being more vulnerable in a given scene, emphasizing differently in the duet with the brother in the second act, but the ornaments of the scene, starting in Ardon Vincenzi, would keep pretty much the same. Which means she liked the style and she liked the way she did it. If you like it or not, of course, you can find versions much more with much more ornaments, such as John Sutherland's. John Sutherland's has, if you ask me, way too much, but that was Sutherland's version. But Maria remains very loyal to what she does for the very first time in Mexico City. Now that we know that she has sung her two bel canto roles for the 1952, we are going to make a small pause to make other comments that I said I had kept for myself. There are several recordings available in a number of sources where you can hear or you can actually hear the voice of a radio host. The radio host under the name of Arrigo Cohen Anitua. Let me tell you a little about him. Arrigo Cohen Anitua happens to be the son of a very, very famous singer in the 1900s. So it is not just any radio host. He was born in Italy and then moved to live in Mexico and decided to remain the rest of his life in Mexico. And he was what some people call an intellectual. He was both a journalist and a very cultivated man who was the host of TV and radio programs with a cultural orientation. So when we listen to him interviewing Maria in La Traviata in that recording 1952, he actually speaks Italian instead of Spanish, which of course Maria wouldn't understand, or English, which is the native language of Maria. He goes for Italian, which happens to be the mother tongue of Mr. Arrigo Cohen Anitua. I also mentioned it not only because he was a journalist and a very cultivated man, because he was the son of a great singer, which means he really knew what he was talking about. He was not just the speaker of any radio program who that day happened to be at the transmissions with Maria Meneghini. No, he himself was an authority in cultural matters. And he is the one who is describing us for the final year in a row, at least for Maria Meneghinis. He's giving us and he's interviewing her and he's sharing with us lots of important comments. But why am I making this comment now? Because even now, but think about 70 years ago. 70 years ago, you arrived to your opera house, we arrived to the opera house, and we see that there are TV and radio, there are radio microphones and TV cameras doing a live broadcasting of what we are about to see. Of course, you know now, and you know back then, 50 years ago, that this happens only when an event is very, very, very important. You know that when we know that we are being recorded, we even behave differently. And that is the case of the 1952s. Maria knows that she was being aired, both radio and national television. Maria Callas happened to be so important um, for the culture at Palacio de Bellas Artes already in the 1950s that she was being transmitted live. You may say now, "Oh, okay, but I can do streaming right now with my Facebook app or Instagram." Yes, but we are doing it now. We are traveling back in time, and having an event of this with radio and TV cameras tells you, man, this is really, really important. And you happen to see that Mr. Arrigo Cohen Anitua is being the host of the program. So you know, man, not only is it important, Mr. Cohen Anitua is here as well. So you know now that we are traveling to the 1952s, that we are witnessing a very, very, very important event in the history of the country, in the history of this opera house. For many, listening to the voice of the radio host and the interviews, because there are interviews of hers mainly for La Traviata and Tosca, many people think that it is funny or unnecessary to leave it on the recording. And it could be if you want to only listen to the music, but if you want to breathe the excitement of what was happening then, you have to listen to everything that is happening. And what actually happened is that Maria was being interviewed on live TV and being broadcasted throughout the whole country. So, man, we are again at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, and we say, man, this thing that we are watching now is really, really important, at least for the history of the culture and opera for the country. Let's go back to our operas, and now we know that she's singing again La Traviata. And the Traviata that we saw the previous year and the Traviata that we are watching now, we notice the progress. We notice how Maria is getting more control over the complete role. Now we see her at much better ease with the movements. We see her at a much better understanding in the relationship because now she's not with a much smaller voice, which I mentioned for the 1951 program. It was Cesare Valetti, beautiful voice, but small voice. Now you have Pippo Di Stefano, a very good voice in the best conditions of his life. Now you really have an Alfredo. Previous year you had a nice Alfredo, but now you really have an Alfredo, and as I said earlier, you have an Alfredo that is already very, very, very loved by the public of Mexico, which pushes Maria. And again, remember that Maria and people had a very good understanding in artistical terms. So they know how to push each other, and they come from their duet Undi Felice, and they have already sung the Brindisi, and you know by watching those two parts that Maria and people really have a connection. So the Traviata that we are watching, this 1952, is by far much, much better compared to the 1951. Maria is at ease. Maria is understanding where to control better her voice. Maria is understanding Violetta Valery better. And now again, fortunately, we have a very good Alfredo, which motivates her more. And we have a baritone that I hadn't mentioned, Piero Campolonghi, which is a very good baritone, very, very good baritone, in the role of Giorgio Germont, with whom she has already had her duet in the second act. And man, if you compare the Traviata from the 1951 from the 1952, it's miles away, at least in terms of being better. Much better Maria, much better tenor, and an extraordinary baritone. 1952's, at least from the recordings from Maria in Mexico, Traviata Maria in Mexico 1952, is much, much, much better result. So people are very happy. We all are very happy. We know that Maria is going to make something great out of this role, and Maria knows it too. And in the intermissions with the radio host that I talked about, we know because that interview is very famous, where she's asked how she felt in Puritani, and she tells us about her previous commitments and what she's going to do later, and that she's going to get some rest. But Maria is there, which, by the way, at some point she looks like bothered when she's asked how she found herself for her Puritani, but that was Maria. Maria was like a lion, as we mentioned earlier. She could jump at anyone if he dared to move, but that was Maria. But Mr. Arrigo Cohen and Itua manages it very well. Uh, and that leads us to talk about her Tosca. Sorry, to talk about her Rigoletto. And you may know already, because we are time travelers, we are at an advantage again, we know that Maria was forced to sing Rigoletto, but she was not forced in a bad manner. She had signed for it in the contract. So you may have read, because there are several sources that are citing the situation, that Maria didn't want to go ahead with Rigoletto. She didn't know the role. She wasn't comfortable with rehearsing it only a few days. And there are many people who put themselves on the side of Maria and feel like, hey man, why was she pushed into singing something she liked? And let me play the devil's advocate. If you know that you don't know the role and that you signed a contract, why did you sign for it in the contract? If she wasn't sure, if she didn't feel well enough to sing it, then you don't sign. But if you sign, that means there is an obligation to do it. So no matter how upset you are as Maria Meneghini, you have to do it. And that's why it says she was forced to sing it. You signed for it, woman. You signed for it, now you're going to do it. You don't like it, you shouldn't have signed it. You don't know it, you shouldn't have signed it. Your voice is not comfortable in doing it, you shouldn't have signed it. But don't come to the opera house manager and say that you're willing to change the title. That is not fair. You are not willing to do it, you don't sign. Period. End of the story. And we know that Maria really didn't like the role. She didn't feel ready. She felt there weren't enough rehearsals. Truth is, she hated this role. So after this Rigoletto in Mexico in 1952 is the only time she sang it on stage. She really didn't like it. The only later recording, the only thing, yeah, the only time she repeated it was a studio recording along with Giuseppe Di Stefano again. So the only two times she sang Rigoletto, the two times were with people, one live, Mexico 1952, years later in the studio recording. The only two times with the same tenor. No surprise. Her studio recording is, by the way, much better. We know it, Time Travelers, but what we are watching on at the Palacio de Bellas Artes is, if not a tragedy, at least really not what we expected. Um, it is often cited that this Rigoletto is sung below pitch, half a tone, and it is true. Half a tone, she asked it to be lowered so that she would be able to sing the Caro Nome, which let me make another comment now. She comes from having sung I Puritani, which is much higher in tessitura than Gilda. Then why does she say that she cannot sing Gilda? You will find comments from many people making reference to her problem in the pitch for Gilda, but they forget to mention that she comes from singing I Puritani, which is much higher. So how come that within a time frame of less of a month, she's able to sing one of the highest roles ever in Bellini, and she's unable to do it with Gilda, which is lower compared to Politani. It doesn't make sense. But if you pay attention to what I said in Lucia di Lammermoor, when I said that she already had a problem with Lucia, then one may be led to think that after singing I Puritani, she noticed that she was starting to have some problem with her voice, which we see in Donizetti, and she knew that it was already too hard for her to do it in Rigoletto. If you picture that timeline, then you understand why she seems to have a problem with the caronome, because otherwise it is completely unjustified. She cannot have a problem in Gilda when she has already sung Bellini, unless she understands that she's having problems with her high notes. Fortunately, the rest of her voice is very complete and goes almost unnoticed. But if you pay attention to, again, let me go back to that, her vocal crisis at the end of the 1951s, singing super high role in Bellini, having trouble with Lucia in the high note, the optional high note of Ardon Vincenzi, and now refusing to sing Gilda on pitch, that is giving us the cue to something. That is my hypothesis on how early the deterioration of Maria's voice was started to being perceived. So it is funny because we know that and we notice that there is something with that caronome. It doesn't sing, it doesn't sound perfect. It sounds lower, and it sounds lower because it is actually being sung lower, which is very interesting because I follow with it in the most important parts. It is that she sang some notes in pitch and some others in the lower pitch. Pretty much, she didn't know the role very well, to be sincere. So at some points, her Gilda seems excessive, seems out of place. Maria doesn't seem to understand Gilda's psychology very well. It is true that it is not a disaster, but it is also true that it is not one of the best outcomes of Maria Meneghini. So people gave them an applause because Pippo is just great, because Campolonghi does very good, but she's not doing very well in Rigoletto. We also notice once again the very common problems she had with words. We mentioned it in previous programs. Maria was known for having problems with the words. She used to forget. She used to forget many words while singing. So there used to be a person, a prompter, who would dictate the words to her. And we in several recordings listened to the prompter because she really messed with the words many times in the 3 years. Not many people mention it, but if you have the score close to you and you listen to all the operas from the 1950, 1951, and 1952s, you will notice that in every opera she had a problem with the words. Something that will be very Maria, as Maria Meneghini would continue to have problems the later years in the words as well. And it is time for us to talk about her Tosca. We know that she sang Tosca the previous year with Mario Filippeschi, great tenor, and now she's singing it with Pippo, Giuseppe Di Stefano, and Pippo is doing absolutely great. Again, Maria every time much more comfortable in the role of Floria Tosca. Her Tosca from the 1952s, we notice it's much more impressive in terms of artistic uh, understanding. She's much closer to what Floria Tosca should be. We notice she's comfortable in the role. The voice is adequate. The temperament is adequate. And we have people who is wow. They have sung their duet in the first act. He has already sung Recondita Armonia, the torture scene in the following act, which is of course very, very good. And people has sung De Luceva and le Stelle, also getting a huge and immense applause from the public. So everything is going great. But now we need to mention something very, very important. This program is named the Farewell because people know that this is the last time, this Tosca is the last time Maria is going to sing in Mexico. And people know that Maria will not return for the 1953 or any other year later. And the reason, if you explore their biographies, they usually fall short in the explanation of this, and you will find the reason in Maria's husband. Giovanni Battista Meneghini was a businessman and he was her manager, and he was very aggressive in the negotiations. There is also an anecdote that says that if the people of Mexico want to sing to another E flat, they will hear it in Ipuritani, and it is also said, but it will cost more. Maria, of course, in advice of Mr. Meneghini, would give or would rank her pricing even higher. 1952 was the last year the Palacio de Bellas Artes was able to cover her royalties. The monies the Palacio de Bellas Artes had weren't enough to be able to contract Maria for a 1953. That is the true reason why she would never come back. And so people, the close circle to the Palacio de Bellas Artes, knew this was the last time. There were hardly money enough to pay her because Mr. Meneghini was doing his job, and his job was making money. His job was making money by representing Maria, and Maria allowed it. That was the reason why Maria would never return to Mexico. As we are reaching the end of these 1952s, I would also like to mention something. I am going to leave in the background the recording of that final part of the 1952s, but I also wanted to wrap up with another comment. We have mentioned that Maria was named La Soluta because look, she sang Bel Canto, she sang Verdi, she sang Verismo, proof of her she was La Assoluta. But what about Di Stefano? Di Stefano was singing the same operas and Piero Campolonghi as well. Why don't we call Pippo Di Stefano il tenore assoluto del siglo? Or why don't we call Mr. Campolonghi the absolute baritone of the century? If Maria was, because she was able to sing it, why don't we do the same? And the reason resides in marketing. I am not denying the importance of what she achieved, but what we shouldn't allow is to believe that she was the only absolute role on that year. You have a Di Stefano that sang the same range of roles and a Piero Campolonghi who also did a great job in singing the same styles with very important challenges. But we are leaning too much on the marketing. We know it because we are time travelers and we like to say she was La Soluta. But if we see it in perspective, man, we're in the 1952s and it's been the same cast Maria, Pippo, and Campolonghi. The three of them singing in all the roles, singing Puritani, singing Lucia, singing Traviata, singing Rigoletto, and singing Tosca. So if we are going to recognize and acknowledge the importance of what Maria achieved, we have to do the same for Pippo and for Campolonghi, just to be fair. But now we are going back to Tosca, and I was mentioning that I am going to leave in the background the original sound of what was happening that year because and it was right after her final note as the orchestra is wrapping up the act. We are going to witness something that is very special. As I was just mentioning, I am going to leave the original recording in the background and I will describe you what is going on because I know that most of our listeners are not speakers of Spanish. We are watching the Palacio de Bellas Artes and we know and we have this sort of nostalgia of sadness in our heart because we know this is the last time we will be able to see Maria in Mexico. And so the applause that we are listening now is not only the applause for a singer who has done a great job, same as for Colombian people. This applause is also a farewell. The quality of the recording, of course, is very poor. It is very barely one can clearly understand anything, but we listen to people with exclamations, brava, brava, and a huge applause all over the place. And then we will also have the voice of Mr. Arrigo Cohen giving us a description of what is going on. But the time travelers are at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, and we already know what's going on. And that bravo has been for Maria. And now listen to this now. One can barely understand it. This is what is called in Mexico a diana. And this is a demonstration from the orchestra from the Palacio de Bellas Artes. And now, right after that diana, as Maria is on stage, we are going to have also a very traditional way for Mexicans to say goodbye to someone. And this is called La Golondrina. La Golondrina is a song that we dedicate to people when we know this is a farewell. To describe you what is going on stage, you listeners, because we who were lucky to travel back in time, we know that Maria is already on stage, and of course she's crying as she sees the orchestra playing for her. Of course she doesn't know the Golondrina, and now the choir has also joined her on stage, singing this La Golondrina, ¿a dónde irán? This song that we Mexicans use to say for saying goodbye, which is of course a piece of sadness and a piece of the best wishes for the one who is saying goodbye. I have spoken too much. Let's listen a little to the choir and the orchestra of the Palacio de Bellas Artes singing this farewell to Maria. This would never be repeated, this demonstration of love for an artist, not that I am aware, never again was repeated a Diana and a Golondrina for a singer by the orchestra and the choir in recognition of the artistry of Maria. The radio host is describing right now Maria is on her knees with her eyes full of tears and sending out kisses to the public at the Palacio de Bellas Artes. She is so deeply moved. Of course, we the public are moved as well. Because we know this is actually, as the Golondrina says, a farewell. We will never see Maria again visiting Mexico. In a few moments, Arrigo is going to mention that Maria is looking for people because Maria would like to get the applause along with Giuseppe Di Stefano. But there is also an anecdote that Giuseppe Di Stefano got very mad because of the huge applause which he thought she was stealing from him because he was already loved. And being the kind of diva that people was, he went to the dress room and left the Palacio de Bellas Artes immediately. That explains why Pipo is not on stage receiving the applause at the same time as Maria.
Quiere reservar el aplauso total y completo de esta noche para la gran María Meneghini Callas, que profundamente emocionada
He has mentioned already the complete name of Maria, Maria Meneghini Callas, just to insist that those years Maria was still Maria Meneghini.
nuevamente recibe una vez más ese aplauso
And every time you notice the applause goes high, is that she's going out to receive and retrieve the applause from the public.
a que salga a acompañarla y él no sabemos dónde se encuentre precisamente en estos momentos.
This is the comment about not finding people
Como supervisor
there.
del control remoto por XHTV interviene el ingeniero Rodolfo
Now,
Torres. Por XCX, el
Arrigo
ingeniero
is
Jesús
going to
Carranza.
be mentioning
El personal
about the
técnico estuvo
people who
compuesto por
collaborated
Carlos
in the
Becerril,
recording
Carlos
and the
Rogelio Rueda en
transmission
las
of the
cámaras,
program.
Daniel
I was
García,
just
Eloín
mentioning
Jiménez
you,
y Cosme Romero en audio y video.
it was
Comentarista Arrigo
such
Ochoa
a
en
moment
Anicúa.
for
Locutor su
the
servidor y amigo Gonzalo Castelló.
world of
Directores de
history
cámaras
of
Margarita
Mexico,
Beltrán y
the history
Dionisio
of the
Escobereta.
Palacio de Bellas Artes that
Asesor
he
musical
mentioned. We are on
Cristian
TV.
Caballero.
These are the people supporting
Ford Motors Company,
the remote
Sociedad Anónima,
which
sus
we transmitted
concesionarios y
today, and
distribuidores
that's
Ford,
how
Lincoln y Mercury en todo el país
the wraps up.
presentaron
He
Oscar
has mentioned
Petruccini
the
a control
radio
remoto desde el
station in
Palacio
which
de
it
las
is being
Bellas Artes
transmitted. He has mentioned the TV
y
channel
a
on
través de
which it is being
XHTV
transmitted.
Canal 4 y XEX,
And,
Voz e Imagen de México.
It is
Amable
also true
auditorio, al
that as we are
despedirnos de todos los que
saying in this
gentilmente nos
farewell
brindaran la hospitalidad de sus hogares
to
esta noche,
Maria,
les invitamos
again,
una
who
vez
would
más en
never
forma cordial,
come
a
back
nombre
to
de
its
Ford Motor
country,
Company,
we
Sociedad
would like,
Anónima,
or we need to say that she received what artists are expecting from their performances. Artists give everything they have in order to transmit it to the public. And the applause is the best you can do for your artists. And that's what Maria received. Maria received in return for her artistry the love of Mexicans. That's what we get from our three travels in time. We could see, we could witness ourselves that the artistry she gave hath love in return. Thanks for having joined me in this last trip to saying goodbye to Maria Meneghini Callas.
You can follow our channel for the latest updates and more content. Opera We Love Singing, in just one word. Link in the description of the episode.